10 high-security prisons around the world that are impossible to break out of. Incarceration is perhaps one of the oldest forms of punishment. Prison facilities that are built to be responsible for holding up notorious criminals have gone through an amazing amount of evolution over the centuries. Bars and guards aren't enough in this day and age, and prison security measures today are as advanced, sometimes as primitively simple, as they can get. Here are 10 of what are considered to be the toughest prisons in the world to break out of. 10. Qiancheng Prison, China. Located at 3,000 feet above sea level, deep inside a desolate valley in the Chongping district of Beijing lies a facility with over 5,000 security personnel guarding the most notorious prisoners of the country. Qiancheng was built with aid from the Soviet Union in 1958, and was originally used in the detainment of Kuomintang war criminals. The prison boasts of the tallest watchtower in the world, looking over a facility that is surrounded by valleys on all sides. What you gonna do when they come for you? 9. Tadmor Military Prison, Syria. Built by the French Mandate forces in the early 20th century as a military barracks, Tadmor Military Prison in Syria is now known as one of the hardest prisons to survive in, thanks to its insane human rights violations and abysmal living conditions. As far as breaking out goes, the facility is in the middle of a desert some 200 kilometers northeast of the Syrian capital, Damascus. On top of which the only way to get in or out of the prison is one tunnel that you would have to crawl. Which, of course, is highly secure. 8. HMP Belmarsh, UK. Prison Belmarsh in Greenwich in southeast London is where category of prisoners are, as deemed by Her Majesty. Functional as a high-security prison since 1991, Belmarsh holds over 1,000 inmates, which include Britain's most dangerous and violent. The security level at the facility is high enough for it to have been earned the nickname, British Guantanamo. 7. Camp Delta, United States. The prison facility at Camp Delta, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, is one that requires no introduction. Part of the base operated by the American Armed Forces, it is a detainment facility that houses criminals that are considered of highest priority by the U.S. We're talking about the place where Al-Qaeda suspects were imprisoned and tortured. Up to 12 guards could be assigned to constantly watch over a single prisoner. In fact, let's say you even sneak out of there, you'd step into the middle of a military base. Good luck with that. 6. Federal Correctional Complex, United States. Indiana's Federal Correctional Complex is a maximum security prison that employs a minimal number of human personnel. Yet, it is considered one of the most secure prisons in the country. Well, with 30-degree surveillance cameras under a constant, facial recognition, motion sensors, biometric locks and a fair amount of the shitty luck most convicts have is more than enough reason for them to not need more manpower. I mean, if Ethan Hunt had to go to prison, this one would be it. 5. Fuchu Prison, Japan. From the simplest and oldest prisons, let's us move on to one of the most advanced security measures prisons have ever taken. Few details are known about the Fuchu Prison in the western region of Tokyo, that has also played host to World War II prisoners in the past. Home to some of the most notorious criminals in Japan, the Fuchu Prison has a perfect track record of no escaped prisoners. Well, none yet. There are more advanced security measures here than you can imagine, and Japan doesn't want anyone to know. 4. Arthur Road Jail, India. Mumbai's largest and oldest central prison, Arthur Road Jail is no joke. Built in 1926, the facility that was originally designed to house 1,000 prisoners is home to over 2,000 inmates at the moment. But apart from the rundown prison conditions and obvious human rights infringement speculation, no prisoner has ever been known to break out, and no outsider has ever been able to break in. The prison, spanning over 2 acres, was built to be an impenetrable fortress. And it stands till date true to its nature. 3. La Santé Prison, France. Built in 1867, in the very heart of the national capital, Paris, France's La Santé Prison is one of the most famous prisons in the world, no exaggeration. La Santé is notoriously known for being the prison that once you go to, you're not going to come out of till you come out. Despite its location in the heart of the city, the prison's architecture and security measures are so simple and effective that it is impossible to get out. A few years ago, a couple of hundred prisoners had to figure this out the hard way, when what they thought was a way out of prison, a sewage pipe, was locked down too, and most suffocated to death. That's a shitty death. 2. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, United States. Perhaps one of the most famous prisons on the planet, Alcatraz has housed prisoners like Al Capone, Whitey Bulger, and Rafael Miranda. Located on an island 2 kilometers off the shore of San Francisco, only 5 of the 14 prison escape attempts ever made were unaccounted for, who were presumed to be dead. Alcatraz shut down in 1968, but still holds the reputation of being one of the toughest prisons to break out of. You know, Swimming's never been a convict's forte.
1. ADX Florence, United States. Colorado's penitentiary, ADX Florence, is perhaps the most secure prison the world has ever seen. We're talking about a maximum lockdown jail where it is said that prisoners are lucky if they ever get to see the sun. With a cell that has no direct access, prisoners are locked up the whole day, without any measure that could possibly help them get out. The Alcatraz of the Rockies, why no one ever escapes from ADX Florence. Just 2 hours outside of Denver, in the parched Rocky Mountain foothills, sits the highest security prison in America. Its official name is the U.S. Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, but everyone calls it the ADX. The ADX in Florence, Colorado, is the one and only federal, supermax, prison, home to the most dangerous and escape-prone inmates in federal lockup. Among nearly 400 male inmates at ADX are several infamous characters. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the notorious drug kingpin, was sent to ADX after escaping twice from maximum security prisons in Mexico. The tuna bomber, Ted Kaczynski, is in there. So is Eric Rudolph, the Atlanta Olympics bomber, the 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, the Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols, the 1993 World Trade Center terrorist Ramzi Youssef. And Michael Swango, a doctor who poisoned and killed up to 60 of his patients. Prisoners don't end up in the ADX by accident. Many have committed murder either on the outside or in other prisons, including killing guards. Others are hardcore gang members who have ordered or carried out prison hits. And a significant portion of the men housed at ADX, as many as a third by one estimate, have a diagnosed mental illness that makes them a serious threat to themselves and others. But critics of the ADX and other supermax prisons argue that regardless of these men's crimes or mental illnesses, the conditions inside these hypersecure facilities, in which prisoners spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, are the very definition of cruel and unusual punishment. According to the United Nations, they even qualify as torture. At other prisons, inmates are placed in solitary confinement for short stints in response to violent or aggressive behavior. Corrections officials call this type of punitive solitary confinement administrative segregation, better known as the hole. At ADX, also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the entire prison is essentially the hole. ADX inmates are confined to their 7 by 12-foot cells 23 hours a day, according to the New York Times. They receive all their meals through a slot in the cell door, and their only glimpse of the outside world is through a thin slit of a window aimed at an empty sky. This deprives prisoners of learning the layout of the prison and the location of their cells. No one has ever escaped from ADX Florence. Since ADX inmates can't be trusted with anything that could be broken down and made into a weapon, all the cell furniture is solid concrete and immovable.
A concrete writing desk, concrete chair, and a concrete slab topped with a thin foam pad that serves as a bed. The bathroom is a combination toilet/sink and a shower that turns on automatically 3 times a week. With good behavior, inmates earn the right to buy a small, black and white TV with a built-in radio, and to borrow books and magazines from the prison library. Phone calls are limited to 15 minutes a month to close family members. Prisoners are allowed 5 visits each month, under strict circumstances. The only time that inmates are allowed out of their cells is for an hour of exercise. Handcuffed and shackled at their feet, inmates are either led to an empty room with a single pull-up bar, or taken outside to the yard, where they are locked alone inside a caged pen. Robert Hood, a former warden at the ADX, told the New York Times that the ADX was not designed for humanity. When it's 23 hours a day in a room with a slit of a window where you can't even see the Rocky Mountains let's be candid here. It's not designed for rehabilitation. Period. End of story. In another interview with the Boston Globe, Hood described the eerie quiet of walking through a modern prison facility where all of the inmates are locked down. The ADX is a far more stark environment than any other prison I've ever seen, and I've been to all of the federal prisons, said Hood. I call it a clean version of hell. Why Supermax prisons exist. There are roughly 2 million people in prison or jail in the United States at any given time. According to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, a small segment of that population poses significant challenges to wardens, guards, and other corrections workers. The difficulty of controlling those individuals, described as the most dangerous, recalcitrant, aggressive, and antagonistic inmates in a prison system, drove the design and construction of increasingly secure facilities. The first, super maximum security, prisons were built in the 1980s, and there are now more than 30 so-called supermax prisons in the United States. ADX, the only supermax for federal prisoners, was built in 1994. Kiramet Writer teaches criminology and law at the University of California, Irvine, and wrote a book about a supermax prison in California called 23/7 Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. The explicit rationale for supermax prisons is that there are people who are so dangerous they have to be removed from the general prison population, and by removing them, everybody else would be better off, says Writer. Theoretically, there would be less violence and you could deter gang behavior by locking people away in these really harsh and restrictive conditions. Ted Kaczynski, ADX Florence. American domestic terrorist Unabomber Ted Kaczynski gestures during an interview with a journalist in a visiting room at the ADX Florence, August 30, 1999. Kaczynski is just one of the many notorious criminals doing time at ADX. Stephen J. Dubner/Getty Images. But Writer says that there's little evidence to support the rationale that near-total solitary confinement is an effective way to address prison violence. On the flip side, there's mounting evidence that long-term solitary confinement is akin to psychological torture and increases the risks of certain types of violence, particularly self-harm and suicide. What solitary confinement does to the body and mind. Writer says that doctors have known since the 1960s and 1970s that solitary confinement and sensory deprivation have immediate and lasting effects on the brains and bodies of prisoners, as evidenced by the experiences of American POWs in Vietnam. We know that locking someone up in solitary confinement can cause all kinds of psychological problems within days, if not hours, says Writer. With supermax prisons, we've essentially been running a mass experiment on the effects of long-term solitary confinement for the last 2 decades. For ADX prisoners, their only regular contact with other human beings are the brief interactions with guards who bring them meals and escort them to the yard. A 2014 report by Amnesty International found that ADX prisoners routinely go days with only a few words spoken to them. The effects of long-term solitary confinement range from depression and anxiety to full-on hallucinations and psychotic breaks. The New York Times tells the disturbing story of an ADX inmate named Jack Powers, jailed for robbery and sent to ADX after escaping from another prison. The isolation sent Powers spiraling into insanity. He cut off his earlobes, chewed through a finger and smashed his head open in order to inject his brain with bacteria-laden fluid. It's just the harshest place you've ever seen. Nothing living, not so much as a blade of grass anywhere, said Travis Dusenbury in an interview with the Marshall Project. He spent 10 years at ADX for assaulting a guard at another prison, before being released. It's so claustrophobic in there. It got to the point where absolutely anything that changed, like if I saw snow falling outside, was what allowed me to survive. ADX has 6 different levels of security, and inmates can move from restrictive to less restrictive housing and possibly to other prisons. But even when released from solitary, the effects of isolation linger. In 1993, a doctor named Stuart Grosjean described a condition called SHU syndrome. Solitary confinement facilities are also called security housing units, that's characterized by paranoia, panic attacks, aggression and psychotic symptoms. Are supermax prisons unconstitutional? The Eighth Amendment of the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and given the known psychological effects of solitary confinement, shouldn't prisons like ADX be outlawed? Legally, the conditions inside supermax prisons are constitutional, says Writer. They have been challenged extensively and no court has held that keeping someone in solitary confinement for any specific period with any specific degree of deprivation is unconstitutional. There is increasing pressure, however, from the international legal community to end the practice of long-term solitary confinement in America. The United Nations, for example, has established the Mandela Rules governing the treatment of prisoners, which prohibits the use of prolonged solitary confinement, defined as 22 hours or more per day, and equates it with torture. There have been some small victories for prisoner rights at ADX. In 2016, the Bureau of Prisons settled a class action lawsuit with 100 mentally ill ADX inmates who were denied antipsychotic medications and left to languish in awful conditions. The settlement led to the transfer of some of the most disturbed inmates to special federal facilities where they can receive better psychiatric care. For the rest of the ADX inmates deemed mentally fit, they are still in their cells serving life sentences in near absolute isolation.